What's going on, everybody? This is the inaugural episode of Game and Went, a new podcast where I, your host, Craig Kober, interview one of my friends, in this case, Casey Kozlowski.
What up, what up?
About the games that we played growing up and how they've affected our taste and how they've affected our interests as we've grown to our blooming adulthoods. Casey, how are you, bud?
I am doing great. I'm glad to be here. It's a sunny day. I'm going to talk about my nerdy past.
It was with Casey that we started talking about, games in depth, and I was like, this would make a great podcast. And so here we are, talking about them finally. So, Casey, one of your favorite games, if not your favorite game of all time, is The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. Is that right?
This is true. Topped only by other Zelda games. So the power rankings have shifted as the years have gone on, but Ocarina of Time was the OG.
For sure. So I've come to the right guy. Tell me a little bit about what Zelda Ocarina of Time is.
All right, so Ocarina of Time is a pretty simple game. I think the whole series is pretty simple, but we can get into that. I think that's what makes it such a good series. You're just literally an elf child, and then you don't have a fairy. There's a problem. You have a dilemma now. So you get up, and you have to go find a sword and a shield so you can go help a tree, a talking tree, and go inside of him to get a stone. And this sends you on a whimsical adventure that, I won't go into because it's pretty cut and dry. You get the stones, you do some crazy shit, you get even more stones, you do a final battle, and on paper it doesn't sound that interesting when I describe it like this, but it's an adventure. It's just, they do adventures so well in Zelda, and Ocarina of Time was the first game, I think, in my life and the lives of those that I know who really enjoy the game, that was just an adventure. There were no frills about it. There's no stats. You don't have to crunch numbers. You're just walking around this beautiful world, finding cool places and going into cool temples and stuff like that. And I think that that charm has withstood the test of time for sure.
Absolutely. It very much is about roaming this world and exploring each nook and cranny and kind of getting to know the inhabitants of it while you're on your adventure.
100%. And also, let me just say right out the gate that I am a 3D Zelda fan first and foremost. I have respect for the 2D games. They're certainly fun, but I'm a 3D expert.
Yeah, and for the sake of, this podcast at least, I know that the first Zelda game I played, and definitely the one that is the most formative in my experience, was Ocarina of Time. And so we're definitely going to be talking about the 3D implications of what I consider to be a genre-defining game.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Zelda wouldn't exist in the way that it is today without Ocarina of Time. If that game didn't stick the landing with the wild success that it did, I don't even know if the series would be around today. That's how influential I think it was, at least for its own genre. You know what I mean?
I don't think a lot of series would be around today without Ocarina of Time.
That is very true, yeah.
It's very much an iconoclast in its genre. You have so many things that have just been introduced for the first time. Nintendo was really cutting edge as far as game design goes when it came to the Nintendo 64 because they had this third dimension, this new space in which to work with. And so they had to adapt the familiarity of their genres and their brands to this literally new dimension.
Yeah, I don't know how they did it. We're veering off a little bit here, but I'm going to compare it to another one that would pioneered its own franchise into the 3D world. That's Super Mario 64. Great game. Love the game, but I think it's a little jankier than Zelda is today. When you go back and play them both side to side, the camera in Mario gives me agita. I can't do it. But with Zelda, I think it still holds up really well. And I think that's just a testament to the love they put into that game. It's there's nothing about that game that's dated in a control way. Well, I mean there is, but it doesn't feel dated, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
For sure. And when you're comparing a game like Super Mario 64 to Zelda, Mario 64 is a game based around the movement, whereas Zelda is much more strategic in the way that you're navigating, especially in fights and stuff. So you're not really worried about, the verticality that Mario is when he's jumping around. You're moving left and right and forward and backward for the most part. So to kind of bring it back, I have a little blurb written up about, little more specific to what the game is about.
Oh, let's hear it. Let's see if you can top mine.
To fulfill a prophecy, Link, a Hylian boy hidden as a Kokiri elf, awakens to his destiny as tragedy begins to encapsulate Hyrule at the hands of the evil Gerudo warlock, Ganondorf. Across the world and time itself, Link collects relics and allies in his fight to release Hyrule from the clutches of the Lord of Darkness.
I feel like you just read that from the back of the box.
No, I typed it out earlier.
Damn. Needs more talking trees. I'll give you that criticism.
But this was one of, if it wasn't a launch title for the N64, it was pretty close to it.
It had to be, yeah, because I remember the N64 entered my life around the same time. Like, I don't think it was like a game that I had been playing the 64 for years before I picked it up. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I remember getting a Nintendo 64, and like the first game I had was Pokemon Snap, and then I went over to my cousin's and he had Ocarina of Time, and he was just playing it, and I was like too young to know what was going on, so I just enjoyed watching him, and it was at least a couple of years before I got one of my own. This was actually the first game that Eiji Aonuma worked on as director, I believe. It was produced by Shigeru Miyamoto, who had previously done all the Zelda games as well, but Aonuma... God, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. If I'm not, I'm sorry. This is like he had previously worked as one of the development team, but this was like the first game that he was the director of, and he has since gone on.
I didn't know that. Yeah.
Yeah, I had to look that up. He has since gone on to do, I think, every other Zelda game, sort of replacing Miyamoto.
To great success, might I add. I mean, he's a master in the field.
For sure. So, tell me about like what was going on when you first played this game. Where were you in like your life? How old were you, if you can remember? Like what were the haps?
Oh yeah. Oh, I remember it. All right, so I lived with my grandma for a while, and we had like this big house, and my cousin lived there too, so we were like roommates kind of. Well, housemates. And I was maybe 6 or 7. I was young. I was a young kid. And so I remember we would get like the Nintendo Power magazine.
Oh yeah. I remember Nintendo Power.
And like my cousin would just crush hard on this character on the front. I was like, damn, he looks so badass. We're just like fawning over this green-hatted elf, because he always looks more badass in the art than he does in the game.
Well, in the game he looked a little derpy, right?
Yeah, it was pretty rough.
Right, in 64 bits you can only look so good.
But man, on that Nintendo Power cover, I was swooning. He could get it. So So we thought this thing was so cool, and it turns out our grandma had it. Like, she had the game.
No
like, she
way.
was obsessed with video games.
Really?
My grandma is what got me into video games. She had everything. She had the NES, the Super Nintendo. She's what got me into Zelda. She has Ocarina of Time just sitting there, of course, with a gold cartridge. I remember we were so into it. Like, we would play this game, and we could never even get past the tree, like the Deku tree. It was hard. And so I just put it down, and like years go by. I'm 11 or 12 now. I'm in California. It's been like 5 years. And this is right when like the internet was starting to become usable. Like GameFAQs was a big thing. You print out like 20 pages of what to do, like MapQuest style.
I remember those, and Cheat Planet was another one we used.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. There are no YouTube videos. You have to just look up these like pamphlets, like an instruction manual, like I'm defusing a bomb.
Yeah, it's like you were planning a trip. You used to print out like instructions in like pages, a triptych.
Yeah. I did that with like the heart pieces and everything. So I played Ocarina years later, and I beat it, obviously. And I remember it gave me such a tangible sense of growth and improvement, because it wasn't that long ago that I sat down and I was like, I couldn't do it. I couldn't get past anything. It sounds kind of cheesy, but like going back and doing that, just playing that video game where I once was never even like able to comprehend that there were things after the tree, that gave me a ton of pride. And that's like always stuck with me since I played Ocarina of Time. And I think it's something the series needs to have. Like, all the games have had that sense of like pride and like, oh, I figured something out. And if it ever lost that, I think it would be a complete flop.
Yeah, and that kind of clues in too. When you solve like each individual little puzzle, they kind of give you that little chime that's just like, hey, you did it, buddy. Good job.
I mean, Ocarina of Time at its core was like, I think what got me to come back to it is because like I never lost that sense of awe that I had when I was in the tree as a kid. Like, it's an adventure game. You see crazy shit and you work hard to get past that, and then you're rewarded for it.
Yeah.
And then obviously I don't know if like spoilers are an issue. This is a ancient game. It's been 2 decades.
I don't think we're concerned about spoilers.
You get past the first 3 dungeons, and then the game completely opens up when you become an adult. And like becoming an adult was so cool as a kid because you're like, whoa, I just time traveled 7 years into the future. Now I'm a grown man with like a completely different set of abilities and stuff, and it's just, it was so cool. Like having that be the first reward you get is like, oh, congratulations, like a entirely different game now.
Yeah. There was certainly this when I got the game, I was so used to these 2D like platformers. Basically, I actually skipped straight from a Nintendo Entertainment System to an N64. I never had a Super Nintendo, right?
Oh wow!
And so going from like playing Super Mario Bros. And Duck Hunt to Zelda Ocarina of Time, you talked about going inside the Deku Tree for the first time, and it's just huge and like eerie, and there's kind of this like hollow, airy sound. Like the background music's just kind of this empty wispiness, right?
Oh yeah, it's very dark.
Oh my god, it's so spooky. And as a kid, I was like definitely terrified of the Skulltulas, but there was also this incredible longing to move forward and know that like I can beat this dungeon. It's very like the Goonies. You're this like little kid, and the challenges are like just spooky enough to be scary to a little kid, but you can also overcome them.
Yeah, with the exception of Redeads, which are terrifying no matter how old you are.
Yeah, I'm still scared of those to this day, as everyone should be. They kind of missed the mark on that.
They're like gruesome zombies that are nearly impossible to kill, and they just let out like just a woman being stabbed behind a 7-Eleven as their soundbite. Like that's yeah, it's very horrifying.
Oh man. So besides like Redeads just scarring you emotionally for the rest of your life, like many of us, what else like stuck out about your experience playing Ocarina of Time?
For this, it's useful for me to compare it to Breath of the Wild, which is a big jump, but that's the most recent Zelda game I played.
Yeah.
And we've talked a lot about what it is because we have very divisive opinions on that game. But I think it's that sense of adventure really came back to me for the first time in a Zelda game in years. And like I was thinking about Ocarina of Time, and that's what it is. It's like the fact that I'm exploring this world with no idea where to go or what to do, and like there are let's talk about Peahats too. We can't forget them. They also scared the shit out of me as a child because you're running around this overworld before you even have a horse yet, and you see propeller death pineapple come out of the ground, and I'm like, well, okay, well, I'm not going here, I'll go the other way. And it's just this natural, because you grow up and they become small, and so it guides you in a way that never feels hand-holdy.
Let me stop you for 1 second.
Yeah.
Because like when you're a kid, they're the really big ones. When you're an adult, you encounter the little ones. Are those supposed to be like smaller because you're an adult?
I always put that, together, because they come out of the ground now, and they're
my God.
pathetic, and you can kill them in like one hit.
That might be the case. I'm just like...
And you mostly find them around like the Gerudo Valley, where you're not really supposed to go when you're young, or you don't have any reason to. The Zora's like lake, the part with like the dams and stuff. And so it kind of naturally gets you out of there with just fear, which is terrifying, but it works.
I guess that's like really good game design, though. That's super cool.
It is, yeah. And it's full of these small things like this where, like, I don't know where to go, and you have an entire town to talk to, and, like, eventually you'll get a hint from someone that, clues you in. That happened to me in Breath of the Wild as well. There was a moment where I just talked to some completely nondescript passerby, and they're like, oh, literally go here and buy this. I was like, oh, all right. And so I think that's what it was about, is that it was a game that was beatable just by exploring and trying to solve the puzzle of like where to go next, or the very literal puzzles of the dungeons. Like these are things you can figure out, and you just like, I remember when I was in the Deku Tree, the first instance of me getting my mind fucking blown, my like 11-year-old mind, is when you have to roll with like the fire to get the web off the like ground. And I was like, wow. Or I think it's like you jump down and then you do like all the fire puzzles. And that's when I started to like, that's when it clicked. And I was like, oh, I can't play this the way I've been playing Kirby on like the Super Nintendo. I can't play this the way I'm playing Donkey Kong 64. this is a different kind of game.
It like demands something more of you.
Yeah, you have to think. It makes you think, and not in a way that you're bashing your head against the wall, with the exception of the water temple, obviously. Like that.
We'll talk about the water temple later.
Yeah.
I got some hot takes.
Yeah. But anyway, so I think that's what it was just like, it was refreshing, is the biggest thing. Like, this game, even though I played it 5 years after it came out fully, even then it was refreshing. So, like, people had not been able to emulate that yet.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's just timeless.
And again, to compare it to Breath of the Wild, like, I think the last time the genre took, like, such a departure from the previous installment was the jump from Link to the Past to Ocarina of Time. And then from, what was the game before Breath of the Wild? Skyward Sword?
Yeah, Skyward. I believe so, yeah.
And then so from Skyward Sword to Breath of the Wild, basically from Ocarina of Time through Skyward Sword, we were getting the same type of game, just with, like, you know, a new engine, new mechanics, new weapons and such. But, like, when it went from Skyward Sword to Breath of the Wild, that was a tremendous jump.
Mm-hmm. It was the biggest one that they've ever done, because even the jump from, the games before that, like 3D game to 3D game, it still keeps the core parts. Like, for me, I actually think Wind Waker is the biggest jump, because you're in this, you just are introduced to sailing. It's like, oh, well, it's Zelda, but there's an ocean now, and you're sailing around to places. And, like, the ocean itself has its own treasures and things to explore. But they still keep heart pieces. They still keep dungeons. They still keep the flow of items. And Breath of the Wild threw that all out the fucking window. And so that was, like leagues above the rest of the jumps for that reason alone.
Yeah, very fair. Let's talk about some more specific stuff. I kind of want to get into a bit of the mechanics about what made this game, like, fantastic. The lock-on system, that is genre-defying. There are countless games now, these third-person, like, hack and slash or adventure or combat games, that use, like, a lock-on system. That started with Z targeting in Zelda Ocarina of Time.
Mm-hmm.
Could you imagine living in a world without, like, Z targeting, without, like, specific lock-ons, and just, like, floundering around trying to slash at things?
It's definitely, like, revolutionary. Like, the lock-on system is essential now for everything. Like, Dark Souls is a great game that's pretty Zelda-like in a lot of ways. And without lock-on, that game would be an absolute nightmare. But there are times you don't want it on, and so having the option has always been very cool. And I think they really nailed it. As it is, it worked really well for the game that you were playing, because
of course,
Ocarina of Time also played into that by having it, most of the game, be like combat with one enemy. And if there are two, then it's like they jump out and they're like, I'm tapping out, dude. Like when you fight the Lizalfos and the Stalfos. So it's like, I think the game was kind of based around the lock-on system, for sure. And so that is something that's, like, kind of hit or miss about the game. Like, I do wish sometimes that it was just a fray of chaos, but that comes later, and, it's for what it was, it didn't belong in that game, I don't think.
Yeah, I feel like part of the reason what you're explaining is, like, so convenient for Zelda Ocarina of Time is that there were never more enemies than, like, you could have on screen at one time. I never felt like I was getting waylaid by something off screen.
Exactly, yeah.
That I, like, had to keep track of while I was trying to, wait for the opportunity to attack another thing that I had locked onto.
Mm-hmm. That also plays into, like, guiding you naturally and rewarding you with certain things. Like, when you do fight the two Stalfos in the Forest Temple, it's a crazy moment, because you're like, I think it's the mini boss, and before you get the bow, and you're like, oh, there's two of them now. Like, I'm not used to this.
Yeah.
You fight the Lizalfos as a kid in the lava dungeon, but they are, like, intended to be out of the fight, and they jump in. You like pot shot them, but the Stalfos are, like, switching out, and you have to figure out which one's about to come at you. And it's very cool, and it's like, it's rewarding, because you're like, oh, this is a new trial for me to face. I'm an adult now. I can handle two skeletons at once.
And the arenas were so different. Like, in the Lizalfos, I remember one of them would just be jumping up and down, like, across the lava pool. And the Stalfos were both, like, shields up, bearing in on you.
In your face. It was very intimate. Like, the room was tiny. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And so it was a very cool moment. But the lock-on system is definitely big. The camera, I want to give credit to, just, like, being able to tolerate the lock-on system so well, and not breaking immediately.
The camera also invited this, like, intensity too. When you actually locked onto something, or even just hit Z, it would, like, go widescreen. Like, the top and the bottom of the screen would, like, narrow in and like it's like watching a widescreen movie where the black bar appears.
Oh yeah, and it plays that sound effect, like that whoosh,
Yeah.
and it like zooms in and just enhances the fight.
That was
so much.
cool. Or just like even when you're like walking through Hyrule Field and you just like hit Z and all of a sudden it's like you're just like jogging in a cinematic experience.
Yeah. Also on the topic of jogging through Hyrule Field,
Sure.
the movement in this game is stellar. This game introduced roll spamming, which is a staple of the
I mean,
series.
talk about genre defining, right?
Yeah, I don't think anything has done it better than Ocarina of Time. No Zelda game does the rolls better.
Yeah.
The fact that you can just spam backflips across Hyrule Field if you want. It's just fun. They don't limit you to like what you can do. If you want to roll the whole game and constantly just hear this kid scream in your ears, you can do that to save a minute of gameplay.
And there were combat implications of that too. Like
Yeah,
when
yeah.
you're actually locked onto something, you can like jump to the right, jump to the left, backflip.
Oh yeah.
If you hit A, you do like a jumping attack that closes the gap and deals way more damage than any of your other attacks.
Yeah, it's very badass. And it's
Yeah.
also like risk and reward, because I remember there are enemies that like hit you out of the air and then you just sit there like an idiot for a minute. It's the movement is like easily overlooked, but I think that's one of the reasons the game has aged so well. It's so fluid, it's so snappy. It's the same one they use in Majora's Mask, I believe, with
Absolutely.
minor differences. And both games hold up very well because of that.
Yeah. The movement, it's almost so like unassuming. It's just like it was so good at doing its job that you don't think about it. It's just part of the experience. If it wasn't there, you wouldn't be playing the game.
To quote the fart cloud from Futurama, he says, if you do something right, people won't be sure you've done anything at all, which is so true for game development. Like, if you are doing a mechanic well, you shouldn't even notice it. You should have to think about it actively to even remember it. That means that it was seamless. That means that it just felt like part of the game. It didn't feel out of place. It didn't feel like it was tacked on. It was just baked into the identity of the title.
Yeah, unnoticeable unless you're a couple clowns like us who get way too into it, apparently.
Yeah, drink beer and talk about Ocarina of Time. There are worse things to do.
Oh, naturally. Better ways to spend your time, I can think of few. But I want to talk too about like the inventory. You had all these different tools and you had to like select your kit, and then you also had, you know, the boots and the armor and the shield that you wanted to use at each given time. You had all these options, and what was cool is that you got to choose several of them because you would assign them to the C button. So you could have, you know, your Megaton hammer and bombs and, I don't know, a potion. Or you could use one of my favorite things, Din's Fire. Just blast open pretty much everything in the area and then just switch to Deku Nuts to stun some dudes out. You had like so many options as to like what your approach would be in any situation.
It played so well into having different like play styles. Like that's something people also don't think about. Is like, I probably played the game entirely different than you. I never even touched the spells, really, the big spells.
Oh, they're so good though.
I use them once in a while to like take down a tough enemy, but for the most part I was really into the sword play and like using my sword for everything. So I would have, you got to have the Deku Nuts.
Deku Nuts
you gotta
are
have
crucial.
Arrows are usually a staple for me.
How often did you find yourself using bombs in combat?
Rarely, if ever.
Right?
Not until later games in the series did that really become like something that they kind of encourage you to do. So not at all, pretty much. I would go in and I'd hack and slash the shit out of everything until I was faced with something that I couldn't, and I would have to be like, oh, time to use a couple brain cells and like open up the menu and see what I could actually do. But
Right.
It's interesting because you clearly played it in a different way, which is something that couldn't be possible if they didn't give you this huge breadth, like inventory space and options. And also, it can be frustrating to have to switch a lot of the time. But without that, it wouldn't be an issue. Like, there would be no different play styles if you could just access everything at every time.
Yeah, you had to be a little more deliberate about it. And to be fair, you could just like pause and go into the menu at any given moment, but it really broke up the flow, and you'd only do that if you were having like trouble with what you had equipped at the moment.
Oh yeah, for sure, because you get tired of it after a
Yeah.
while. You know, even if you're trying to really have some fun with switching out on the fly, I'm telling you, like by the time you're adult, you're gonna be so sick of and just like shuffling through these like slides, these PowerPoint slides, clicking a thing, backing out, accidentally saving the game because the B button was to save the game, getting out of the save menu, and then unpausing.
Yeah, it was a little clunky.
Not nearly as fun as throwing a nut at someone. You know
Give
what I
him
mean?
the nut, right?
Give them the nut, as we like to say here.
Anyways, I want to talk now about the dungeons, because this is like the best conversation piece, I think, when talking about Ocarina of Time. What were your favorite and least favorite dungeons? And maybe any shout-outs.
Oh, man. Well, I mean, I'm not going to count Water Temple, because that's like... that was just shittily designed, I think. Not even poorly designed, because they handled it really well in the remake, but with the mechanics that were in the game, it was very frustrating. So I don't count that really.
Yeah, I'm gonna talk about the Water Temple like real quick, because I was thinking about this before we started the call. Water Temple was way ahead of its time. I remember the things that frustrated me most about it when like I was playing it as a kid and even like as an adult was you'd have to spend so much time swapping out inventory things. Like you have to go swap the boots, which was just a terrible mechanic.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Like if it weren't for that like cumbersome system, it would have been really good. And in the remake, I think they make it so you can map the boots to the C button, which pretty much solves the entire issue.
That was something they introduced in Twilight Princess that they did apply to the remake. Great decision. And you also had like the hook shot moments where you were on like a moving platform and you had to like hit the tiny little eye with the really sensitive joystick controls in the first person aiming. And that's another thing that at the time was just, it was like very ambitious. We have games now that like make us hit moving targets with like a shot of a gun or you throw something at them and it's no problem. But on an N64 when your navigation was this like very flimsy joystick, it was just a lot to ask, I think, of the player.
For sure, and I think it's just a result of the times. If you look just a brief aside to like compare a similar issue, like Skyward Sword had a ton of gimmicky aiming. Like you would aim with the Wii Remote, obviously, for nearly everything. Thanks. This was a problem in Twilight Princess as well. But then in Breath of the Wild, they had really solid gyro controls. They had finally figured out how to make it not terrible. Mm-hmm. So when I'm playing handheld in that game, I often just use the gyro. I don't even touch the other joystick.
Really?
Yeah, it's like, and so it takes a couple games sometimes. And I think that was, again, over ambition. It's like, well, people don't really want to aim a remote at the screen like they're flicking through Jeopardy and Wheel of Fortune to find like the small bat that I'm trying to kill that's like flapping around rapidly. Yeah. So yeah, the Water Temple struggled at, I think mostly just from being a result of its time, where the mechanics that were in the game did not make a fun time there, I'll say.
But nowadays, I think it set the floor plan for that experience, but just better in future titles.
Yeah, of course, cool. for sure. I think the temple itself was pretty.
It was very pretty too.
Now, if I were to actually, and the music is great. If I were to actually pick a least favorite, it's tough. I think I'd go with maybe Fire Temple.
You know, I think it's the Fire Temple for me too, honestly.
I think so. I was gonna say also the Whale. But I like the Whale. It's just that the Whale is so short and like...
Yeah.
But it's a kid dungeon, so I don't know. I think I have to go with the Fire Temple because that's one where I get there and I just groan. Yeah. And I'm like, all right, let's get this over with.
I was actually looking forward to starting a new playthrough of this kind of to follow up our podcast here. And I was like, well, hang on. I'm going to get to the Fire Temple and I'm not going to want to play anymore.
Additionally, when you get done with the Fire Temple and that slog, you're rewarded with the most like mechanically poor temple in the game, with the Water Temple. So it's just a double whammy of like 2 to 3 hours of just misery, which really kind of grinds everything to a halt, which is a shame because the stuff that comes after that is incredible.
Yeah, the Shadow Temple and the Spirit Temples are both excellent.
Top notch. And Ganon's Castle itself is just breathtaking.
Yeah, which is something I find they don't do very well towards the end of Zelda games these days, is give you like a great final temple. But to kind of go back to the Fire Temple, you just had these like very open spaces. There was a lot of like jumping from rock to rock over a pool of lava, and you had to wear the red tunic or else like you'd melt or whatever after like 10 minutes. And it was just not very fun. The puzzles were confusing and very like vertical oriented, but the spaces were also so huge that it made it hard to keep up with where you were navigating to in that vertical space.
100%. You hit the nail on the head. It's a huge space, and you're prevented from getting through it quickly as well, because every other room has these annoying fire mazes that you always forget which maze you're in. And so these fire things come out. Wouldn't be that big of an issue. If I remember correctly, I think Wind Waker also had this with the plants. And they did it a little better. But the problem with Ocarina of Time is that when you hit one of these fires, you go flying a mile into the air and you go, ah! And it's like, okay, this gets really old after running into two walls in a row, and you're often going to be bumping into these things the whole temple, and it just slows things down. If you just took some damage...
The walls don't show up until you get close to them, and so you're like tiptoeing through this maze, and God forbid you take a misstep. Now you lost control of your character and took damage for like 5 seconds.
Yeah, and then you're disoriented, it wastes time, it's just annoying. And
it was a bit of a mess.
It's a slog, yeah. And I think it could have been, and they did fix this in later installments. I can't remember for the life of me which one it is. I remember there was a game where there was a maze like this. I was immediately frustrated, and then I ran into the wall, and something miraculous happened. He just flinched a little and took like some damage without screaming at me. And I was like, oh, this is a lot better. I don't have to be afraid now of this maze. Certainly the maze served its purpose by making you think on your feet, but I think it just slowed it down too much. It became very tedious.
I agree. So Fire Temple sucks. We definitely agree on that.
I will say the music is very cool, but...
But what about your favorite temple? Let's get into the good stuff.
Oh, God. Yeah, let's see.
I have such an easy answer, and it's the same every time. So if you're thinking, I'll toss mine out there.
Yeah, go ahead.
It has to be the Forest Temple.
Anyway, so what do you like about that dungeon, besides the music, obviously?
So it's the first temple that you take on as an adult. And so right out the bat, you just become an adult. Everything's changed. You get this new sword that deals more damage. So enemies that you've previously fought that were like mini bosses, like when you're a child, you fight a Wolfos, and it's tough. And then as an adult, you fight a Wolfos, and it's like a normal enemy. I always love when games set that up, like an early game boss becomes a late game enemy. So you go into this temple, it's in your like hometown, it's in the Kokiri forest, so everything is familiar, but there's always this one little spot you couldn't get to. So you finally get the hook shot, you chain up, you enter the temple, and you're introduced to this overrun, creepy, like haunted mansion. It's just gorgeous. The music is my favorite in the game. It's just this like haunting, like chiming and like wispy.
It's gorgeous. I think it's the best track in the game as well. We're in agreement about that.
Without a doubt. It has the most character, I think, out of all of the dungeons, excepting maybe the Spirit Temple. But the Forest Temple just looks like lived in. It's like an embassy or a hotel or like a mansion. There's just so much character to each room and like the carpets. And when you finally get to the boss of the temple, it's like an art gallery. It's just remarkable.
It's like someone's estate.
Yeah.
What happened to this place? That is very creepy. And the whole dungeon is creepy. And you know what? I think I'm going to double down on this and also agree that it's my favorite temple. It's so fun to go in here after you become an adult because you're like, oh, I love this one with the creepy spinning rooms. And I mean, it also, like, the enemies feed into it. You're fighting undead in this dungeon pretty much the whole time.
Stalfos, the bubbles.
And don't forget the ghosts, like the ghost sisters.
Oh, and the pose.
Yeah.
That's right.
And they're haunting this place. And then you get out to this courtyard, and it would be gorgeous if it wasn't overrun with like the Deku plants, like the snapping plants.
Deku Babas, they're called.
Yeah, like Skulltulas all over the place. And it's like, whew, it's creepy, man. And the music doesn't help. It's unsettling, to say the least, but very eerie and serene.
So while we're talking about the music, I'm actually going to edit some of the song in right here so that people can give it a listen, because it's so worth hearing.
Yeah, all right, check it out. Listen to this. Back. Isn't that gorgeous music? It's like very creepy. Like it's like chanting almost. There's something in there that's like human, and you can't quite put your hand on it.
It feels like almost like will-o'-the-wisps or fairies are kind of like singing a little bit, with like the little...
Yeah, but it's just like distorted. It's weird. Yeah, it's
very otherworldly for sure.
Yeah. And I think that nothing in the game until you get to that temple has that kind of music or that atmosphere, with the exception of the Deku tree, which is like kind of has those elements in there, and the Forest Temple just takes it to that next level.
Yeah. Shout out to Koji Kondo for a wonderful composition again.
Oh yeah. And you really introduced that new thing. I never really thought about it as a lived-in space, but it's totally true. There's carpets. It's like it's a very beautiful place perhaps in the past it was. I think it would have been cool to see it as a kid, and maybe it's like some dude lives there or something.
Well, I think it's like it's been long abandoned. Like when you were a kid, it was there. You just couldn't get to it. So it's like we're talking hundreds of years ago. Maybe something happened there before maybe the Kokiri Forest even became like the Kokiri Forest. There's so much mystery.
Yeah, you're right. I guess that's true. 7 years is not that long. When you're an adult, like Ganon is in control. Like he's succeeded at that point in the game, and now you're like fighting in second place to get to him and stop him before he can fully complete his goal. And so look at like the Temple of Time is a good example. Like it's in ruins when you are an adult, and as a kid it's beautiful. It's cheery, it's serene. So I don't think it's necessarily. I'm not saying that this thing aged a century's worth in 7 years, but I think the magic could have a part of it. I think the fact that we're even having this conversation about what happened to it is really good world building, and it's leaving good mystery in a space. I don't care what happened to the fire temple. I don't know what the fire temple is half the time. I feel like I'm just in a fire cave.
I don't care what happened to it, and I don't care what happens to it.
Yes, I very much hope that it all just gets shot out of a volcano into the trash where it belongs. Yeah, so harsh. In terms of music too, I think that's a good jumping off point. I'm trying to think of anything that even comes close.
I mean, you could argue like the Ganon boss battle theme is very good, but they're just so different. Like the Ganon theme's got like a lot of energy, and you know what? I'll play a little clip of that here too if I can find one.
I think the battle music is incredible. Like when you hear that little trill in the beginning, like
yeah.
And then it just gets like intense. It usually happens for like mini bosses and stuff.
Yeah, you're thinking of like the mini boss specific music, which is very good.
It's very badass, and I'm always hyped when I hear it. I'm like, whoo!
It's good at creating the tension.
It's also you kind of get this Pavlovian response for the mini boss music after a while, and you're like, your boy's getting an item after this.
The last thing I have to talk about in the game are like the best moments. So like what were the best scenes, the best fights, the best like upgrades that you achieved? What were your favorite moments in Ocarina of Time?
I gotta start with the spider web again, because that's like you are climbing up the Deku Tree at the very beginning of the game, and you have no idea how this world works really. You haven't had any challenges besides like outrunning a boulder for a second and killing a couple plants on the way in. And then you're faced with this floor. You can see down into it. It's great design. You can see, like, I got to get down there somehow.
Yeah, you can tell that that's where you need to be. But you only can go up.
Yeah, you can only go up. And so if you're like me, you eventually see these little perches, and you're like, oh, I got to jump off these. And so you jump off one. You see it bounce, and it still doesn't break. So you're like, oh, God, I got to get higher. And it's naturally guiding you up to this place. And I remember just the hype when you finally jump off the correct one and don't kill yourself like I did numerous times by missing. Like, yeah. Where he just, like, locks into place and is like, ah! You hit these webs, and they're going down. You're like, come on, baby, break. And then they finally snap. You hear the, essential Zelda chime that you just solved this puzzle. And it's like, oh, man. That moment will forever be in my head, because that was, like, the first Zelda trial I had to overcome without a guide, any clues whatsoever. I was just on my own. If I didn't get it, I just went to bed and like slept on it. Like there was no like, oh, I'm gonna give this a Google real quick.
And that's a practice you still do to this day. I got to watch you play through the new Link's Awakening, and you didn't look up anything. If there was a puzzle you couldn't solve, you slept on it and came back the next day.
And a brief sidebar, there's a reason for that, because I used a guide from start to finish for Twilight Princess. It was a terrible, and it was just, I don't know why I did it at the time. I think I was just really interested in like 100%ing it on my first run. And so I didn't want to get locked out of rooms or whatever. Whatever the reasons were, it was arbitrary. It made for a shittier Zelda experience. And so now I'm definitely like a purist about it, at least for my first run. And I think that's why I had such an incredible time with Breath of the Wild, because that game, if you don't look anything up, it's just breathtaking, the stuff you uncover on your own time, whenever you want. Ocarina of Time is full of these moments where you have to knock your head against it. Give me some of your moments as I think of more, because the web sticks out first, but I know there's a lot more that are like big.
So we definitely talked about it earlier, but the moments when you first pick up the Master Sword and the camera for the first time like zooms upward and you're surrounded by this blue light, and then all these people start talking to you from this other dimension. You're in this like space in between, and this like spooky music starts playing, and they're explaining like what's happening. And then when you come to, you don't even see yourself. You're just looking directly at Sheik, a character they introduce. Sheik's explaining like Ganon's taken over. Also, don't be alarmed, but take a look at yourself. And then the camera pans at you, and you're huge. You're this big dude, and you've got like a white undershirt on underneath your tunic. And you were talking about how cool Link looks on the box art. He's got this baller earring, which is very 90s.
It's the earring, bro. I'm telling you about it. Yes.
It's the earring. When you were a kid, you saw this tough, like, 17-year-old elf with an earring and, like, muscles, and you were just like, oh, hell, it's about to go down.
I'm so glad you brought that up. I forgot all about
it,
that.
dude.
That's what it was. He had this, like, it was like blue or silver. It was like a ring in his ear, and I was like, damn. It was just badass, man.
To talk about real quick the textures, do you notice how every item in Zelda is shiny? Everything you get when you pick it up and you hold it over your head is like very shiny.
Yeah, it's something else.
They really took a lot of liberties with the metallic textures on this game.
Yeah, like when you're in the ice, like mini dungeon thing.
Yeah.
And like the rupees are the most shiny metallic things you've ever seen, despite being in an ice cavern for years. Like, you'd think they'd be a little frosted over. I don't know. I'm not a scientist.
I didn't think too heavily about that.
Anyways.
It's got to be, like, my best moment, for sure. It's just, like, nothing, I think, has even come close to, like, the gasp that I let out the first time that happened to me.
It is very badass. I not so much the adult thing, but going into that alternate dimension or whatever with the sages. Like, at first, it's just the one dude, and he's like, dude, my friends are dead. Or captured, and you have to get them back for me. And I was like, wow.
All my friends are dead.
Yeah.
Help.
I was like, all right, well, shit, I guess this isn't, like, just a whimsical journey anymore.
It's like you said earlier, Ganon won.
Yeah, he wins.
Like, you're playing the first part of the game as a kid, like, to prevent that, and it's not like you failed, but you failed. So when you come as an adult, it's like, all right, so everything sucks, we messed up, but we can get it back.
Yes.
And the stakes just skyrocketed. And even as an adult, that's one of the best story moments I've experienced.
It's cool to be the underdog and fight to take back your world.
Yeah.
Rather than most, I think, I'm not going to say most. It's been a while since I've played a lot of the 3D games. But I don't remember the stakes ever being like that. Again, with the exception of like Twilight Princess, where Zant is very much...
Even in Twilight Princess, though, it just never felt quite as heavy, you know? It was like, it happened right from the get-go, and when something's introduced so early, it doesn't have the same weight, I don't think.
Exactly, yeah. Well, and a big thing in Ocarina of Time that has to be mentioned if we're talking about the way the story pans out and why it's so rewarding is just these, like, scary moments in the beginning with Ganon.
Yeah.
I think you get a nightmare of him, like, very early on.
He's, like, galloping through fire on his demon horse.
Yeah. And then when you finally see him in the castle, you're hanging out with Zelda after you snuck in, and you're peeking through the window, and he's sitting there, and he just snaps, and he looks at you, and he's like, gotcha, bitch.
And he's got those creepy yellow eyes.
Yeah, and it's like, oh, God. And then finally, when you come back to Hyrule Castle, and you know what? We'll double this up. This is one of my favorite moments in the game. You're coming up to the castle, and the bridge won't lower. And you're like, what's going on? Why isn't this lowering? And I think this is right when you get all the spiritual stones. And Ganon comes out, and he's got Zelda on the back. And then she, like, yeets the ocarina into the moat.
Yeah, it's actually that Impa is riding with Zelda on the front of the horse. And they're running from Ganon. So Ganon's giving chase. Like,
oh, that's what it is.
You
Okay,
get to see
yeah.
his plan, like, the very beginning of the end in action.
That's right. I do remember that. Yeah, and it's so cool. And so when you finally get to the future and you're like, well, it worked. So now you have to travel through time and do some time fuckery and just undo what he did and get the sages back. It's like, wow. Like this, it's not like this came out of nowhere. They were hinting at it the whole time. You could see Ganon succeeding as a kid more and more. and then it finally happens, and you're like, that's cool. It wouldn't be nearly as cool if that was the first time you saw Ganon as an adult. Like, the fact that you see him as a kid laying down the groundwork, bowing to the king. Like, these are very cool moments that are often overlooked.
I agree, actually. I never thought about him bowing to the king so specifically, but I guess that just shows to the lengths that he's taking to enact his plan. He's, like, humbling himself. He's kind of, like, getting everybody to trust him so they can pull everything out from under them.
Yes. And I think it's a cool way to show that he's a twisted guy and, like, very dark. I think he's one of my favorite incarnations of Ganon, for sure, if not my favorite.
Oh, he is without a doubt my favorite, for sure. And I want to talk about one more moment before we start to wrap things up again. When you encounter a boss in all these dungeons, it'll say their name and then a kind of like a title. I think Goma is something spider, Baronade is like electric parasite, and then you get to Ganondorf, and it's Ganondorf, what is it, King of Evil or Lord of Darkness or something like...
I thought it was like King of Darkness. Yeah, we're
King
close. We're beating around it somewhat, but it's something like that, and you're like, oh.
And then you beat him, and the tower starts to collapse, and like you make your way back down to the tower, and then from the barren rocks and boulders that the tower has crumbled into, his like ghostly corpse jumps out. His eyes are glowing yellow, and he bears the Triforce of Power, and then lets out this blood-curdling scream as he transforms into this tremendous monster. And then the title shows up for the monster, and all it says is Ganon. That was incredible. That, like, the setup of expectations, and then, like, flexing so hard without having one.
Yeah. And that whole fight is very cool, too. I think that would be another moment where just, like, Zelda's actually helping you. I'm just a sucker for games where, like, someone that's been useless the whole time, or any form of media, has this clutch moment. And she always does this in the end with, like, the light arrows.
Yeah.
And it's so badass in this one, because you're like, I think you're a kid again? Am I remembering that correctly, or are you an adult?
No,
still?
you're an adult.
Okay.
Because you're fighting, and then Ganon knocks away the Master Sword, and it, like, lands next to her.
Oh, that's what it is.
And then you have to use the hammer to hit the tail, and then you go back and get the sword when he's stunned, and Zelda holds him down as you deliver the final blow, Link's iconic 3 slashes. It's so good.
Yes, it's hype as hell. It's very dope. A great ending to a great
Seriously,
game.
they seriously stuck the landing.
Oh, and you gotta discuss the ending too, how bittersweet it is when you're like with Zelda and it just cuts to like the blue sky with clouds and she's talking to you and she's like, well, you're gonna be a kid again, man. Thanks for the help, but you deserve to like live through your childhood.
Yeah, and all of this stuff that happened isn't gonna happen. That's like kind of the...
Exactly.
Like all the stuff that happened after you went into stasis or whatever just never happens. Because you stopped it from happening.
Yeah, which is awesome. Because you don't want it to happen, but it's bittersweet. You're like, man, all these people I knew, and like I grew up to know these people. Or when I was an adult, I knew these people, and now they're just non-existent. And it's cool. It's a very good send-off to the game.
And then they kind of show you like a little wrap-up in the credits of where everybody ended up. Like you get to see Saria, and she's like there waiting for you, and you know, Rito's becoming the Princess of the Zoras, and Daruna's dancing around because that's what he does. And so there's like, you get to see them happy, but like, yeah, you just never go through that all with them, except for like, I think you must remember because you have that ability.
Yeah, and I'd like to think that there's, you know, definitely a lot of theorizing you could do. I'm sure he might have stuck around and saw some of those things through, but either way, it's a good, again, like much like the Forest Temple where you could just debate on what happens after the fact. Yeah. I like that they just leave it open. And they're like, well, the future's yours now. You're a kid again. You saved the world. Be a kid.
It opens us up to having these conversations.
Exactly. And it's just a beautiful ending to a game that's shrouded in a lot of mystery and like world building in a very subtle way.
Well, I'll tell you what, man. That is all we've got for today. What a great chat. I could talk for another hour about this game, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not even opposed to like doing more of the Zelda games in the future, because if you want to see true nerd form me, we got to talk about Wind Waker, because that's the one I grew up with at an age where I could respect the story when it had come out.
Yeah, maybe there's a future episode for the Wind Waker somewhere in here.
For sure.
I'd have to probably replay it.
Yeah. Oh God, it's just great. I think everything about it is great. I will save it. I don't want to ramble about it now, but I enjoyed the chat. Thank you for having me to discuss this game that I grew up with. It's cool to go down memory lane and kind of see it with an adult lens now, and respect a lot of those things that I probably didn't care about as a kid. I'm sure the ending didn't matter to me as a kid, but now it's cool to see that. Like, okay, go be a kid. Like, it's cool. It's cool to look back.
Yeah, to see these fond things from our childhood through the lens of an adult.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you so much for being the guest on my pilot episode, man. There's nobody I would rather have.
Yes, truly, I appreciate it. I hope to be back in the future for more chats.
I am certain you will, man. I've already got some thoughts, but we'll get to those in a future episode.
Awesome.
And thank you so much for everybody for listening. This has been a joy. I'm looking forward to doing a lot more. It's been something I've been cooking up for a while, and so I hope you've enjoyed yourself as much as Casey and I have, and we look forward to the next episode.
Indeed.
As always, don't forget to save. Hey everyone, this is Craig. One more time, I wanted to thank you all so much for listening to the pilot episode here. I really appreciate your time. I know there's so much content out there, so thanks for listening to mine. If you wanted to follow the show, I do have a Twitter. It is @GameAndWent on Twitter, and I'll hopefully be posting another episode within a month. Hopefully less than that, but it we'll have to just see it when I can get it out. I am doing my best to edit all this stuff, and I know I'm not super great at it yet, but that'll only get better over time. So if it sounds a little wacky, just bear with me for a bit. I hope the content is good enough to make it worth it. Thank you so much. See you next time.